Hello, and welcome to this tech tip from Will. In this tech tip, I will be looking at how to install roles and features to an offline virtual hard disk. This is a new feature to Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2 that gives network administrators greater flexibility when deploying roles and features to virtualized infrastructures. I will start by looking at how virtual machines and virtual hard disks work in a Hyper-V environment. Once you understand this, later on in the video, I will demonstrate on my Windows Server 2012 R2 Hyper-V server how to install a role onto an offline virtual hard disk for one of my virtual machines. So let's get started. The first topic to cover is virtual machines and virtual hard disks. So, what exactly is a virtual machine? A virtual machine is essentially a software computer that runs on the same hardware as a physical computer. That is, a virtual machine looks and behaves just like any regular computer. The only difference is that it runs entirely in software. To better understand virtual machines, imagine that you have an ordinary server that you have purchased from a hardware retailer. With the server in place, you next install an operating system, such as Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2, onto the server. With the operating system installed, administrators are then free to install some kind of virtualization software, called a hypervisor, onto the server. Examples of hypervisors include Hyper-V, VMware, and VirtualBox, just to name a few. The job of the hypervisor is to create and manage virtual machines. In this video, I will be using Microsoft's Hyper-V hypervisor, which is built into Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2 Standard and Data Center editions, to run my virtual machines. So let's imagine that the hypervisor installed on this server is Hyper-V. When you create a virtual machine using Hyper-V, the hypervisor will create an XML file. By default, the XML file is stored locally on the Hyper-V server. The XML file contains all of the configurations for the virtual machine and actually mimics the hardware found in a regular computer, such as the processors, RAM memory, and hard disk controllers. Every virtual machine created in Hyper-V has its own XML file. In fact, you could say that the XML file is the virtual machine. To sum up, a virtual machine is a software computer which, under the hood, is essentially an XML file. The XML file is usually located on the physical Hyper-V server and mimics the hardware found in a computer. Now that we know what a virtual machine is, let's move on and discuss virtual hard disks. As the name implies, a virtual hard disk is essentially a hard disk for a virtual machine. Just like an ordinary computer uses a hard disk to store its data, a virtual machine uses a virtual hard disk to store its data. As with the virtual machine and the XML file, under the hood, a virtual hard disk is essentially a file stored on the Hyper-V server. With Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2, there are two types of file format that can be used for virtual hard disks. These are VHD and VHDX files. The main difference between the two formats is that the VHD format can create virtual hard disks up to a maximum of 2 terabytes in size. The VHDX format, however, can create virtual hard disks as large as 64 terabytes. The VHDX format is a new format introduced with Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2. As such, the VHDX format is not backward compatible with virtual machines created on earlier releases of Hyper-V. Just like the XML file mimics the hardware on a computer, VHD and VHDX files mimic hard disks. In short, VHD and VHDX files are essentially files that are designed to behave like regular hard disks. With the virtual machine and the virtual hard disk in place, you can then install an operating system, such as Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2, onto the virtual machine. When the operating system is installed, the virtual machine can be used in much the same way as a physical computer. That covers our overview of virtual machines and virtual hard disks. So let's now move on and discuss installing roles to offline virtual hard disks. With Windows Server 2008 and Windows Server 2008 R2, if you wanted to install roles and features onto a virtual server, you would first have to boot up the virtual machine. You could then log on to the virtual machine either locally or by using a remote desktop connection and install the roles and features. Whilst this remains the case today, with Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2 comes the added ability to install roles and features onto a virtual machine even if the virtual machine is shut down. This is achieved using Server Manager. It is worth noting at this point that, in order for this to work, the offline virtual machines you plan to install the roles and features onto must be running either Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2. You cannot perform role installations on offline Windows Server 2008 or Windows Server 2008 R2 virtual machines, for example. In addition, Microsoft recommends that when you install roles and features to offline virtual hard disks, that you use the same version of Windows Server that is installed onto the virtual machine. That is, if you have an offline Windows Server 2012 virtual machine, for example, you should perform the offline installation from another Windows Server 2012 server. Likewise, if your offline virtual machine has Windows Server 2012 R2 installed, you should install the roles and features using another Windows Server 2012 R2 server. To demonstrate how this works, I will, in my lab environment, deploy a single physical server named Hyper-1. This server is running Windows Server 2012 R2 and has the Hyper-V role installed. Using Hyper-V, I have created two virtual machines named 2008 R2 VM, which is running Windows Server 2008 R2, and 2012 R2 VM, which is running Windows Server 2012 R2. Since there are two virtual machines on this Hyper-V server, this means there are two XML files that correspond to these virtual machines. These XML files are stored locally on Hyper-1, which is the default location. In addition, both virtual machines have just one virtual hard disk each. These virtual hard disks contain the operating systems for the virtual machines. In my case, both virtual hard disks are using the default .vhdx format, but the process is exactly the same with the older .vhd file format. The virtual hard disks are also stored locally on the Hyper-1 server. In the demonstration, I will shut both virtual machines down and will then use Server Manager on my Hyper One computer to attempt to install a role onto both virtual machines. So I will now change over to my Hyper One computer to show you this. This is my Hyper One server, which is hosting both virtual machines. First, I will start by opening Server Manager. Then, from the top right corner, I will select Tools and Hyper-V Manager. This opens the Hyper-V Manager console. Notice, at the top of the console, we have the Virtual Machines section. Below this, you can see my two virtual machines, 2008 R2VM and 2012 R2VM. At present, both virtual machines are in the running state, which essentially means they are powered on. To prove that both virtual machines are running the operating systems I claim they are running, I will first double-click on my 2008 R2VM virtual machine. This opens the virtual machine user interface. As you can see, at the bottom, this is, in fact, a Windows Server 2008 R2 Enterprise Edition virtual machine. I will now close the user interface and will double-click on my 2012 R2VM virtual machine. If I initiate a Control-Alt-Delete, down at the bottom, you will notice that this is a Windows Server 2012 R2 virtual machine. With the operating systems clarified, I will now right-click on each virtual machine in turn and will select Shutdown from the drop-down list. After confirming the shutdown, both virtual machines will shut down gracefully and will enter the off state. Now that both virtual machines have been shut down, I will close Hyper-V Manager and will return to Server Manager. To install a role or feature to an offline virtual hard disk using Server Manager, simply click the Add Roles and Features link to launch the Add Roles and Features wizard. On the initial screen, just click Next to open the Select Installation Type page. From here, select the Role-Based or Feature-Based Installation radio button and then click Next. On the Select Destination Server page, select the Select a Virtual Hard Disk radio button. Further down, in the Server Pool section, you are required to select a server to mount the virtual hard disk file to. You can mount the virtual hard disk to any server that has been added to your Server Manager console. Since there is only one server in my Server Manager console, I will select this server, Hyper One. The final step is to select the virtual hard disk that has the virtual machine's operating system installed. If the virtual hard disk is stored locally on the server, you can use the Browse button to locate the virtual hard disk like this. However, if the virtual hard disk is located on a remote server, you will need to access it via a shared folder. This will require you to place the virtual hard disk into a folder, share the folder, and set appropriate permissions on the folder so that it can be accessed by Server Manager. To show you which permissions to set, I will demonstrate by opening File Explorer and will browse to the C, Users, Public, Documents, Hyper-V directory. In this directory, notice that we have a folder, Virtual Hard Disks. By default, this is where Hyper-V stores the virtual hard disks for all virtual machines. As such, this is the folder I need to share. If I open the folder, notice that I have two virtual hard disks listed, 2008 R2VM and 2012 R2VM. These are the virtual hard disks for my virtual machines. If I go back a level, I will right-click on the virtual hard disks folder and select Properties so that I can show you how to configure the permissions. In the Properties dialog box, select the tab Sharing and select the Advanced Sharing button. Next, tick the tick box Share this folder and enter a share name for the folder. To configure the share permissions, click the Permissions button. By default, the group Everyone has read-only access to shared folders. Microsoft strongly discourages the use of the Everyone group in shared folders. So, to conform to best practice, I will select the Everyone group and will click the Remove button to remove the permissions. Next, I will click the Add button. Since I am logged on as the local administrator, I will give the local administrator user account access to this share. Since changes will have to be made to the VHDX file, I will tick the Allow Change checkbox to allow write access. However, user-only access to the share is not sufficient to complete the task. For the process to work correctly, you are also required to add the system user account and configure Allow Change Permissions also. I will now close all of the Permissions dialog boxes and File Explorer and will return to the Add Roles and Features wizard. To mount the virtual hard disk from the network share, simply enter the path to the share, which, in my case, is /hyper1 /VHDS followed by the name of the virtual hard disk you want to mount. For now, I will choose to mount my 2008 R2VM.VHDX virtual hard disk and will then click the Next button. Notice on this occasion that I have received an error message of the request to list features available on the specified server failed. I have done this on purpose to prove a point. The reason I have received this error is because I have selected the virtual hard disk that belongs to my Windows Server 2008 R2 server. Remember, you can only install roles and features onto offline virtual hard disks that have either Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2 installed. So I will remove the reference to the 2008 R2 VM virtual hard disk and will replace this with the 2012 R2 VM virtual hard disk. Notice that this time, Server Manager was able to retrieve the server roles from the virtual hard disk. I am now able to install roles and features onto this virtual hard disk. To keep things simple, I will select to install the fax server role, and will next my way to the end of the wizard and click the Install button. The fax server role is now being installed onto the virtual hard disk. This should only take a couple of minutes to complete. When the installation does complete, I will be prompted at the top that the installation has succeeded. So I will close the Add Roles and Features wizard and will reopen Hyper-V Manager under the Tools heading in Server Manager. Next, I will right-click and start my 2012 R2 VM server. When the server finishes booting up, I will double-click on it to launch the graphical interface. I will then send a Ctrl-Alt-Delete command to the server and will log on to the virtual machine. When Server Manager on the virtual machine opens up, you will notice that, in the left-hand pane, the fax server role is now listed. Furthermore, at the top of Server Manager, notice that there are some post-deployment configurations to make for the fax server role, confirming that the role has only just been installed. This concludes this tech tip from Will. I hope you have enjoyed this tech tip and found it useful. For more Windows Server 2012 and Windows Server 2012 R2 tech tips, please browse our collection of videos on YouTube. And remember to leave your comments, like our videos, and subscribe to our channel to be notified when we release new videos. Many thanks, and we'll see you on the next tech tip.